When Sebastian asked me to speak, well, first of all, thanks for coming. I only assumed like Sebastian and Marlene would be here. But when he asked me to speak, I said I would probably talk roughly about what the argument is in the book, the theoretical argument behind the book, and then try to give some context as to why I think it matters beyond theory. And as I think, sadly, most of us are probably familiar with, you have expectations of having presentations done well before, working out all the kinks and making sure that they're polished, but it doesn't always work out that way. So I figured out what I was going to talk just a few hours ago. So this could be a little rough, but we're in it together, right? Which reflects so much of what life is like. And largely that's kind of the argument that I'm ironically making within the book. What I'll begin, like I said, is sort of giving an overview of the initial problems I'm talking about the book, what I'm theoretically arguing and why it might be relevant, and then coming back to why it might matter in a broader context. I should also add, this is one of the few times I've ever done PowerPoint, so if this seems a little rough, you'll appreciate why. All right, so it worked out okay. So there's sort of three kind of main problems that I'm trying to address within the book. One is how to understand variation and change. And these are broad problems which I think we'll come back to, and you'll start to see maybe why I think they're relevant. How you understand variation and change, how we theorize movement, and how do we see knowledge, right? Something which we know exists. We talk about it all the time, but how do you actually study it? How do you make sense of what constitutes knowledge in a way that you can begin to sort of see the pieces that go into making it? Part of this is because I think there's a need to understand the process of becoming, right? How do we come to be who we are? And so I promise this won't all be a philosophical engagement with the topic, but I think it's actually a really important one that we take for granted, and sort of being more critical of that whole process might give us a bit more understanding of what problems are that we're looking at. There's also a certain understanding that when we talk about global issues, really we're talking about local responses or local engagement with interpretations of what it might mean beyond where I live. Right? So within anthropology, and this book really comes out of both an anthropological and a religious studies type of frame, we tend to see the local as saying something about the global, right? The particular is saying something general. Yet when we talk about sort of political theory or contemporary problems within politics, we tend to see them more globally, looking down locally, where we bring in our own biases and prejudices and such. And so part of what I'm trying to get at is how then do we sort of see what constitutes local knowledge and how that gets played out more broadly. One of the reasons why I think one of the reasons I have a concern for the process of seeing how people become Muslim in an Islamic area, which is that I think that it gives us an understanding of the influences that we all have. I think that even though I'm talking about the case of Kyrgyzstan, I think it's a broader theoretical argument. And how we try to live in a particular environment and work our way through in sort of not a straight line, but a very indirect, sort of confrontational, sort of with our neighbors, with our state, in a way that sort of is imperfect, right? This we see sort of played out within security discourse around a secular state, and I'll come back to this a bit near the end. How Islam gets characterized as being threatening, or how it gets characterized as something that is sort of opportunistic. It gives us a way of dealing with sort of the challenges and struggles that exist within life. So working through these types of problems of looking at social change and variation, theorizing movement and such, I try to get a sense of how how we can learn from sort of particular cases of local people and what it might tell more broadly. Roughly the area where I was doing the research and where it's largely concerned is as would be no surprise, Kyrgyzstan. It's in the title, so it was catchy that way. And there's two main regions where most of the work was concentrated. It was in Naren Oblast, and many of the sort of villages sort of in Naren, and then also in Osh Oblast were places where field work was actually done. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in 1999 through 2001, living in Naren. Back in 2004, 2005, and multiple trips in 2016, 12, 13, and maybe some in between. You forget after a while. But and the latter trips were mostly spent in the south, living in Osh, but working in Nokat and other places. I did quantitative and qualitative work. My own interest really is largely qualitative as an anthropologist, but you always have this lingering question as to whether or not you've only talked to the 20 people who think in the same way, right? So I did a large survey of religious practice, which was, I think it was around 860 respondents to a survey that was around 180 questions. It was a long survey, but it was an opportunity to try to sort of get a sense of what the quantitative field looked like, and it also gave opportunities for more specific type of discussions that took place around doing the survey itself. There were two groups, for example, where that was particularly interesting. One was Hizb ut-Tahrir, and the other was Tablighi Jamaat, where I had acquaintances, people who I had come to know relatively well, and were quite interested in the survey, and some of this I've written about elsewhere, but their responses were very different, and these responses weren't used in the broader quantitative analysis section in the appendix, but what you saw was how within Tablighi Jamaat, the person who was responding to the questionnaires, who sort of helped distribute them, critiqued everyone's responses. Right? So he went through and he said, I've only got two that actually are right. So that said something, and then we had this long discussion about what it meant to be right and talking with other people. So it served as a way of sort of entering that. With regards to the people with Tablighi Jamaat, it was very different. They were very enthusiastic in responding in the beginning, but then as they went further, because there were sections about religious knowledge, they didn't answer them, right? So they began talking about how it wasn't that they were right or wrong, but they didn't have time to engage with these types of questions and such. So anyhow, even though there was the quantitative aspect of the survey, it produced also qualitative information that was useful. Most of the interviews were with elites, or excuse me, were with non-elites, and through informal discussions, though of course there were some with elites. They tended to say what they felt I wanted to hear, but that was still nonetheless important. A few other things that I think are useful in terms of having an overall context of what the book is framed about. It has a large number of characters. There's about 30 people who sort of become central actors within the text, which within anthropology is somewhat unusual, and that was intentional. Part of that was built off of the idea that there's a collection of poems by Edgar Lee Masters called Spoon River Anthology, and within the collection you learn about villagers through poems, right? They're obituaries of these villagers, and you learn about their relationships with other people. And so some of that takes place in the text and the discussion within the book, that you learn about other people through the relationships with each other, but you also don't have as much information about some people within the book as you might want to, right? So there's characters that you want to know what happens to them, and there's places that you want the loose ends to be tied up. And that was intentional, precisely because I think that one of the broader arguments that I'm making in the book is that it's that messiness, it's that uncertainty, it's that incompleteness of knowing that we see in the text also reflects the way in which we engage with knowledge in life. Right? So just as we don't know all about the interlocutors of the text, We also don't know all about the interlocutors with whom we engage on a daily basis, right? All knowledge is incomplete. And so there is that sort of underlying feeling within the book as well, I think. So I'll go through briefly sort of the main problems that I went through, and then I'll go in more detail, a discussion as to what I mean about this, about studying knowledge and how we can get at it. So if we're talking about the need for understanding variation and change, there's all kinds of examples that one can begin with, but the first one that came to me when I was contemplating the project was differences in religious practice throughout Kyrgyzstan. Differences between the north and the south, between ethnic groups, Kyrgyz and Uzbeks or whatever, how those get articulated and how they get rationalized. One of the common answers that I would hear is that the Uzbeks were more orthodox in their practice because Islam came to the Uzbeks earlier, which at one level makes sense, but of course it doesn't really make any sense because we all learn about a religion within our lifetime. So there really is a short window where it really matters as to when it came. There was this explanatory value associated with it, and how much do we sort of criticize or critique those types of things? Clearly it's more than it just arrived in the 7th or 8th century in the Fergana Valley and in the 19th or 18th century in the mountains, right? It's more complicated. How do you understand these variations? How do we make sense of those types of changes? Also, I think the idea of change and variation is something that's programmatically relevant for anyone who's trying to govern. Education is really social engineering. Right? You can't make people do things, but you set conditions up where they're more likely to believe things or act in particular ways. And there's variation and change around how these processes go through. The Soviet experience was one of trying to change how populations acted and how they behaved, specifically around sort of making differences in behaviors. So this is one of the things that we begin to see. We care, I think, about variation, like I said, and change in the way that it impacts stability in an environment, and in the way in which people both engage with each other and how they engage with being governed or how they're governed. So I think that there's broader context in which we have these concerns. And we see certain moments within any culture that this takes place, whether it's transition from what was before communism and to and then moving beyond that, or whether it's creating different relationships of groups around ethnicity or not and such. The second issue that I think the book tries to address in a way is how one theorizes movement. This is something I think that we do pretty poorly, right? And it really is a challenge of how do you make sense of life as it's being lived. Most of theory talks about things as going sort of in a straight line, linear, right? It goes from point A to point B. And my guess is that most people here as well talk in those contexts. That if you ask someone how you got here, whatever success that was that brought you here, you can construct a narrative that is logical, that is purposeful, that is directive, and it's usually a straight line. It's neat, right? Because you leave out sort of the haphazard things that may have come up that reflect more of how things are, right? It's sort of, John Dewey talks about it, who's an American pragmatist, talks about it as sort of being in a lost in the woods, or where you have a sense of where you're going, but you're sort of meandering around, and sometimes you might end up somewhere else. I think that happens quite a bit in life, and yet we don't theorize that type of chance or happenings or opportunistic responses to things, events that take place. So one of the things that the book really tries to address, amidst the ambiguity and the not knowing fully about other people, is sort of this sort of fluidity of movement, of direction, and of arriving at a place and then having to explain how you got there. One example of this that I give when I teach religion and culture class is that you may find yourself. I, for example, ended up going to I grew up in a small farm town. There were two churches, a Catholic and a Methodist church, and I ended up going to the Methodist church because that's where all my friends went. Right? I mean, that's where most people who I was most wanted to spend my time with were. Had nothing at all to do with theology or religious understanding or any of that. Likewise, I would see those types of things repeated in various villages where people were going to the mosque not because they cared about theology, but because everyone else was, right? So, yet if you ask them about it afterwards, after they've been going for a while or they've sort of modeled themselves as being a religious individual, they give a very different sort of directional type of answer to explaining this, right? So we have to have a way of sort of making sense of this. So, like I said, life is not lived in a straight line, and there's a few other things I think that become relevant within this is that even though we speak of certainty, we live with ambiguity, and we also have a great deal of cognitive dissonance that we ourselves are not willing to grant others, in part because we accept for ourselves sort of the bottom, a sort of going to C model, whereas others we may accept only the A to B, right? So you're doing this, but if you were a good Muslim, you wouldn't do that, right? Or if you were a good Jew, you wouldn't do that, or whatever, right? So even the way in which we engage in explaining our relationship with others is not always consistent. Now, why is it that I think knowledge matters? And part of that is a discussion within anthropology. So anthropology is largely concerned with questions of culture. Yet I think if we talk about what people do as knowledge, we value it differently. We somehow value knowledge as being worth a bit more, I think, than culture. And there are things that are that we know that are beyond culture. Certainly culture is part of knowledge. I mean, we know our culture and we're aware of that. But what I'm trying to articulate is moving back a bit more and seeing a broader context in which we understand engagement with others. There are things that I know that are independent of my culture. And there are things that I know that I struggle with articulating. But I know them, right? So I know Marlene's face, right? And yet I can try to describe it to someone, and I don't do a very good job with it. But yet I know it. Or I can say that I know Beethoven. But again, I can't describe it. But again, I know it. So there's things that are outside of culture that become important to how we understand the world. And largely that falls into construction of knowledge, which is sort of the way in which I'm trying to articulate that. I want to say that we know things that are not simply culture, and I think this matters because there's a relationship between knowledge and action. That what we know influences our moral understandings of the world, how we understand right and wrong, and that in turn influences how we feel about a situation. Right? It has an emotive and an affective influence on our lives. Now, the question, of course, is how is it that we come to know what we claim we know? I know that sounds almost tautological. It's not intended to be. But there's a process by which we come to understanding our environment and our surroundings and making sense of it, much of which is not always thought through. How do you make sense of that? And again, I promise I'll try to come back and make this seem relevant at the end and not merely esoteric. Right? Basic knowledge does have, or basic research should have some application, I think, in the end. So part of what I was trying to do is how do you make knowledge more manageable as an analytical category or as an analytical tool, and less abstract. So one idea was to construct it as having three components that are all in relationship with each other. A social organization, a corpus of knowledge, and a medium of knowledge. Now, it's not that any of these things exist in and of themselves, independent of each other. As you see in the diagram here, really they're all in relationship with each other, and they're all coordinating at the same time. It's a construct to try to suggest that we can only look at one without looking at making sense of the others, but yet, nonetheless, we have to, otherwise I think it's too complicated. I'll try to move somewhat quickly through the general framework of these things, so there'll be hopefully more time for questions and answers at the end. In terms of the social organization, what do I mean by that? I think all knowledge is framed within a particular context. It's in social relations. We know how to engage and how to respond to people, or we try to find different cues of what that is. That is both in terms of restrictions that are placed upon us, and also opportunities or potentialities that allow us to move in particular ways or not. And you can begin to sort of make sense, I think, of some of those, whether it's state restrictions and potentialities. Certainly there is a social organization, a social construct that's imposed by certain state structures, whether it's an open political system or a closed political system, something in between, your relationship to the state as well. You find these same types of things, whether it's around things like religion, whether it's or whether it's social conventions that may or may not be connected to religion, may be rooted in tradition or understandings of tradition. You also find it around economic types of limitations, whether you have a certain amount of affluence that allows you to do things, or that you're more restricted by the absence of wealth. All of these things have an impact on the social organization in which people live, how they interact with each other, and how they're sort of making sense of the world in which they live. Knowledge, I think, as I'll talk about a bit later, knowledge, I think, is largely experiential. Right? We know things from doing. And I'll come to that in a bit more a bit later. What do I mean by the corpus of knowledge? Really, it's, as it would suggest, the body of knowledge, that content of the information. And you have also different ways of framing that content that influences one's understanding, whether it's a historical or a social frame. We see this, for example, in whether someone's in the mountain or in the valley, if they're somewhere in between. So if in some of the places where I was doing field work, you would have people who would be right at the foothills of the mountains, and sometimes they would articulate themselves or talk about themselves as being mountain people, or they may articulate themselves as being valley people, identifying one place or the other. The in-between spaces are always hard, but they're also very interesting precisely because of that. Right? What they know, how they know, whether in the village or the city, whether they grew up during the Soviet Union, whether they grew up after. All of these things, sort of historical and social frames, impact what they know, largely through what they've experienced. You see it also in terms of professions, the work that's done, whether it's agricultural, business, whether it's educational, medical, government, whatever. All of these things really constitute a different way, different body of information that's contained. You also see it within the level of education, and also the commitment to education. Likewise within a religious frame, whether you're sort of more leaning towards an environment of a general religious revival, perhaps a more restrictive religious environment, or one that is largely in conflict or in opposition to there being any need for religion. All of these things, I think, allow us to begin to have ways into understanding how people behave differently and why. At least that's part of the argument. In terms of the medium of knowledge, there's different ways in which knowledge is conveyed. And that does actually tend to have an influence on how people make sense of it, right? There's discursive and non-discursive ways. Spoken and written is sort of largely the discursive forms that I talk about most. And you see within that, in sort of, in places where there is more oral transmission of information, there tends to be an openness towards greater ambiguity. You don't have to have the story right every time. You have a general story, it may get repeated, and you may have a series of stories that the details conflict a little bit, but the general amount is roughly the same. People who are, who sort of grow up with that type of medium, or sort of privileging that type of medium, tend to allow, like I said, greater ambiguity. You don't have to have things specifically worked through. If you focus more in a textual environment, it becomes a bit more complicated, right? Because in the case of religion, you have a text that is that takes the authority of the narrative outside of you and me, right? It may place it within God, in Allah. It comes from God, and you can point back to all of these disagreements that you and I may have about the details. Well, we can go back and we can say this is what it really is, and you were wrong, right? So there's sort of social implications for how knowledge gets conveyed in terms of how we understand variability and openness to variability. You also have the role that gestures and rituals and actions play in our understanding of the way in which knowledge gets transmitted. For example, I may say one thing. I think it's trying to think of something that I don't want to use anything that might be seems offensive, but see, this is the problem with being recorded. I might say that I like someone's shirt, right? So like, wow, that's a really nice shirt, Sebastian. But then, I do something with my eyes, and I'm actually not being serious about that, but the text would suggest otherwise. Or, and these are subtleties of transmitting a message that can be lost in a text. Or it may be that I participate in a ritual that allows me to imagine a relationship with people in another country. We do this all the time in terms of prayer, right? And, for Juma Namas, I am praying not only myself, but I'm praying with the people around me and the broader Muslim world. Or you can think of communion as such within Christianity. All of these things connect us in different ways, right? The mediums, I think, have an important way of conveying information. I'm going to expand that a bit more. I've really sort of been largely abstract and theoretical, I think, in the conversation, which never leads to a really engaging or appreciated talk. But nonetheless, let me try to give a sense of what I mean by that. If we look more at the experiential nature of the medium of transmission, right? There's different types of experience as well. Right? There's direct experience, and there's indirect. Direct you might participate in, and you make sense of what that meant later, and then there's indirect where you're doing it otherwise, or after, sort of by observing. An example of a direct active engagement would be perhaps watching a father teaching his son how to pray. An indirect, so direct passive medium of transmission might be the son watching the father pray. Right? Both of these places you begin to understand what it means to pray. As well, you have, in terms of indirect, passive would be the son mimicking the father pray, whereas indirect would be more of an active indirect, would be more of the son watching the father pray. And a passive, indirect passive would be of the son noticing that the father's praying. All sort of different variations of one's engagement with an act, a participatory act. Whether one was in, whether one was knowing that it was happening, or whether one was directive, part of that. A lot of times when we realize the things that we know, it's not always in the forefront. Sometimes we're surprised about the things that we know, right? So this passive form of indirect knowledge does play a significant role, I believe. Placing some of these things together, you sort of get a broader frame of how it might play out if you combine sort of the oral and the textual and the experiential, right? So it may be that in the oral tradition you have, in sort of oral medium of transmission, you have reference to tradition, which allows ambiguity within the changing narrative. It may be part referencing of the tradition, part referencing of a text that you may or may not know. It could be someone say, for example, this is what the hadith says about this act, though the person's never actually read or can't read Arabic. Or can't read the text in translation, right? But still, they're willing to do these types of things of referencing things that we do. And there can be then, uncertainty and ambiguity, or that can also lead to sort of arguing for inflexibility, the type that you might find in referencing a text, for example, which may also lead to non-negotiability of things. And then the experiential is what helps us process these bits of knowledge, I think. Right? It gives meaning to whether we privilege the orality over the textual, or the meaning itself. So what, right? Part of what I think looking at knowledge that way is, part of the reason I think it's useful is I think that it, as I mentioned, it gives us things that we can begin to look at and make sense of how people begin to behave differently. But it also allows us to take a step towards the process of social navigation, right? How we move from one point to another point. You can begin to see the ways in which that is not necessarily haphazard, but it's directional. Not that you can necessarily forecast the way in which people will end up, but that you see there is a particular logic about it, and that there's also a particular striving that people engage in the process of becoming who they are. This is really a narrative that I think is probably familiar to most people, if not everyone. I think it's the process of how we come to where we are, right? How we explain it, but then when we're honest to ourselves, how we sort of see the different directions that we've chosen to move towards a particular path. I think the reason that matters is that you see the messiness and the variation and the change, what comes to have had influence, and it allows us to sort of see a broader method in the figuring out process of things. Variations are not simply regional, but they occur within communities, and they occur within relationship to other people, right? So sometimes neighborhoods are not uniform at the micro level, because all of these individual processes are taking place in relationship to other people. But yet we can see the various threads of these narratives influence particular patterns. And I think the social navigation that we see in looking at knowledge helps us get to some of that. There's, of course, some underlying biases and prejudices that it also allows us to see. We all have biases. I don't think that's an inherently bad thing, but I think it's something that we should be honest about. I think the reason we do is precisely because of how we know things, and what it is that we know, and what it is that we value. Again, I talked about sort of what it is we know influences our understanding of right and wrong, our sense of morality, and how we feel about things. And so, if we recognize knowledge as a context for local understanding, we can see the way in which people construct meaning, and we also can see our own biases and prejudices that might influence our interpretation of that. For example, it may be, and this is where I think it becomes more useful, it may be that I have a particular way of seeing the state, or a particular way of seeing religion, a secular way of seeing the state may be constructing it as something that needs to be protected from religion. If I am religious, I will see it very differently. Those two are opposing views that you can't easily reconcile. But recognizing that you have a particular bias and predilection towards seeing the state as being as threatening towards religion, or religion as threatening to the state, can influence the way in which you understand it, and also how you understand the population that you're trying to make sense of. Is any of this making sense? Okay. Really, I mean, now that I'm near the end, it's probably not the right time to ask. But, so I think it helps us understand what local conceptions of security are. Right? How people frame well-being, how they understand the role that religion plays in their becoming, the role that it doesn't play, the role that it should or shouldn't play. It helps us understand a more complex answer to questions that I think impact social life. The idea, like I mentioned, of the role of secularism as being to protect the state from religion doesn't necessarily imply the absence of support for secularity among some groups. Some people, for example, who are religious are quite supportive of a secular state and insist upon it. But they may experience the state as in a quite negative frame, and therefore not be supportive or willing to go with the way in which the state is advocating the direction it should be. Part of that has to be, like I said, is around the nature of experience and how they understand what democracy might mean or what state control might mean. Religion is not merely a response as well to the world, which would sort of be Freud's take on things, right? The world is broken. It's a place of suffering, and religion is a response to mitigate those sufferings. But rather, for some people, religion is it frames an understanding at another level, at a level outside of this world. Right? So we live within this world, and yet, which is a very sort of horizontal relationship of people to each other. But a religious conception adds a vertical dimension to that, right? That we have not only the relationship that we have with people around us, but we have a relationship with God which transcends that. A very different way of framing and understanding the problems and the solutions to problems. This becomes relevant with regards to things like understanding violent extremism, or which may have less to do with religion than it does with social issues, or the failures of governance, or explanations that are seldom sympathetic to the context of lived environment, lived understanding, lived knowledge. Looking at knowledge and the process of becoming, I argue, affords greater empathy, which is essential to understanding the context in which problems exist. And thinking that through, I think perhaps gets us closer to addressing the real problems rather than perhaps the problems that we come to assume exist because of our own biases. I we'll open it up for questions there, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much.